Welcome to the Hero Maker podcast. I'm Andrea Schreeman, writer, director, EP, living in LA.
I'm Jennifer Morrison, and I currently serve as the Commissioner of Public Safety for the state of Vermont.
We are here to seek out and tell the full story of our friends who were murdered in college, Rachel Raver and Warren Fulton III.
We really need to make sure that their deaths were not in vain and that every possible lesson and improvement for the system can be squeezed from the retelling of the circumstances that ultimately led to the identification of their killer.
Hi, everyone. This is Andrea. I was so honored that my co-host, Commissioner Morrison, introduced me to one of her law enforcement colleagues for this week's episode, U.S. Marshal John Cary Bittick, who also served Monroe County, Georgia as sheriff for well over 3 decades. Even though John Cary is a big, tough lawman, those are Jen's words, he brought a ton of heart to our conversation, which focused strongly on how communities pull together in times of need and approaching law enforcement from the perspective of service. I hope you'll enjoy this conversation as much as I did. Hi, John Cary. Nice to meet you.
How are you?
I'm well. Oh my gosh, Jen, you're so excited to have John Cary here. I like it.
Hey, this is one of my favorite law enforcement people.
Well, welcome to the Hero Maker podcast.
Thank you.
I'm Andrea Schreeman, and it's just an honor to meet you. I was able to glean a few things from the internet on your career and your life. You're a rancher, is that correct?
Yeah, that's right.
And you've been a rancher for a while.
Long while. Most of my life.
Was that a family business or was that something that you started?
No, it's a family business. My grandfather and great-grandfather started it.
Wow. That's what a legacy. And what a perfect segue also, because law enforcement is also a family business, apparently.
That's a long time too.
And did that go back past your father as well?
Oh yeah, my grandfather and my grandfather's brother. So 1921.
Can you expound a little bit on that and the legacy of sheriffs in your family? I wonder if there's probably never even a question in your mind what you were going to do with your life.
Oh yeah, no, I knew from the time I was a kid. My grandfather's brother, who was R.C. Bittick, he got elected in 1921. And in 1923, his appendix burst. And of course, in those days, you didn't just go to the hospital. So by the time he got to the hospital in Macon, they couldn't operate on him and he died. Of course, we had the cattle ranch at the same time, but we owned the Ford dealership here. My grandfather ran the Ford dealership. He kind of volunteered part-time with his brother who was sheriff. So my grandfather ran for office and got elected in 23, and he retired January the 1st of 53. So he was about 30 years. And then my dad ran in the 1960 election, the same election John Kennedy ran in, and got elected and took office in 61. And he was sheriff through 1982. And then he was president of the National Sheriffs, and they hired him to be the executive director. He moves to Washington as executive director of the National Sheriffs, and he's up there about 9 years. Of course, I ran for sheriff then in 82, got elected in 82 and took office in 83. And I was here till 2018, so about 35 and a half years. My dad, after he was executive director, he moved home, and Bill Clinton appointed him U.S. Marshal for the Middle District of Georgia. During the Clinton years, he was Marshal. And then in 2018, I got appointed Marshal. And so I was there for a little over 4 years.
Wow.
And then I was ready to retire.
I just am curious about your purview during that time. What were you actually accountable for?
Well, I had the whole Middle District of Georgia, which is 73 counties, I believe. And so it's a really big geographical area. It goes all the way from the Florida-Alabama line in southwest Georgia, all the way up through the center of the state, and then all the way to the South Carolina line in North Georgia. And of course, we had offices in Albany, Valdosta, Athens, Macon, and Columbus. And so we had deputies kind of scattered out through all of those areas, and they work most of the federal fugitive warrants. And of course, they do work court and inmate transportation and that kind of thing. And then they're in charge of the security for all the different courthouses. And then we had the fugitive squad that operates out of Macon, and they do all the state and local warrants. So they do a lot of warrant service, a lot of fugitive type investigations.
Did that feel like a natural progression from the work you had done as sheriff?
Yeah, for a sheriff, it's a pretty easy transition because you do basically the same thing. But the only real difference for me was you deal less with the public when you're marshal and more with attorneys and judges and other law enforcement executives. Whereas sheriff, just about everything you do is dealing with the public. So I kind of missed the people interaction part.
Can you say a little more about why you think your family's tradition runs so deep? So many people today don't follow in the family tradition. Tell me a little more about how it is that so many generations of Bitticks took the sheriff's office.
You know, I think somewhere along the line, probably when my granddad was sheriff, considering that he was sheriff so long, for 30 years, it almost became like you were part of everybody's family and everybody was part of your family. So it kind of, I'm not going to say blurred the lines, but because it's not a negative thing, I think it was a positive thing. And I think you see that in different areas. There aren't that many families where that happens. There are only 4 or 5 in the whole United States that would be in that category of multi-generational sheriff lines. The Radcliffes in Ohio, of course, the McLaughlins, there's us, there's only a few. And what I see, I think, as the difference there is you really honestly become part of everybody's family, and they all become part of your family, and you just wind up dealing with people from that perspective. And it just changes the whole interaction from, like, let's say if you're a chief of police and you come into an agency where you didn't work or you don't have any history, and in a community where you don't have any history, it just changes that whole interaction with people. And the families that look at it like that, they're in office to help people. They're not in office to arrest people or go out and lock a lot of people up and send people to prison. They're there to actually try to help people, especially when people are at a point in their life that they need help the most. You just want to be there for them.
Sounds like the quintessential co-production of public safety in an area. If you know the community and have trust with the community to the degree that you just described, it really is what we all, as chiefs and sheriffs strive for, which is to co-produce safety with the community.
Yeah, it's like the origins of community policing. I mean, it really goes deeper than that, because you really do look at people as though they're part of your family, and they look at you that way. But yeah, that is the whole object with community policing, is to try to get to some medium with that.
You're talking about people in your neighborhood, people who look at you that way and you look at them, and there's this just acceptance that, like, that's who we are. We do the law enforcement, we do the sheriffing. Our family cares for your family in this way. So you're talking about like the other citizens, or are you also talking about people like in city government and stuff like that?
Well, no, I'm talking about more like the citizens, the people in the community. And it's just not like the community right in your immediate neighborhood. It's like the whole county, and people start looking at you as though, if I really need help, this is the guy I'm going to. It might not have anything to do with law enforcement. Most times it doesn't have anything to do with your sworn duty. It's something personal for them or something for their family that they need, that you try to, and you get it. You try to get it for them. And that's the great thing about being sheriff, is generally you have the power and the means to be able to do that. You just have to use it for that reason, to help people.
Use your powers for good, not evil.
That's right. That's exactly right. Yeah, that's one thing is you get to a point where you and your family take a back seat for everybody. And my dad used to have this saying about how to treat people. What he said was, you have to treat the guy that sleeps under the bridge the exact same way you treat the guy that owns the bank. It doesn't make any difference whether they're black, white, rich, or poor, own the bank or sleep under the bridge. They've all got to be important to you.
That's a great place to come from in your life and your work. John Cary, are you aware of the death of our friends in college?
I am. Jen told me that story. I don't even remember how many years ago, but it was early on after we got to be friends. And I even remember we were having dinner somewhere and sitting around talking, and she told the story about what had happened to her friend. And it, of course, obviously that really touched me. And still to this day, when I think about that situation and think about all of y'all being the age you were when all of that happened and what kind of a shock that had to be, because I can't imagine if that had been me during my college years when I was at Auburn and something like that happened I can't even imagine where my mind would have gone with that whole situation and the loss that you probably felt over a long period of time, because the case was like not solved for a long period of time. And so I think what gets lost in some of those cases, and I've had several over the years, but what gets lost in some of those cases is the impact not only on the family, but the impact on the nucleus of all the friends and everything, and how hard that is on people like that. A lot of people never get over it. They just never get over it or never able to resolve that.
So Rachel was my teammate, and her boyfriend, Warren, who was murdered in the same incident, was on the men's baseball team. And about a week ago, we had a lengthy interview with two of his teammates who we were friends with back in college, and their coach, Coach Castleberry, who, Andrea and I knew who Coach Castleberry was, but we didn't really know him very well. And here we are 34 years later, having this interview with teammates from the baseball team and the baseball coach. And it was like not a day had passed. You could hear in their voices the impact of losing Warren and Rachel. And it was just incredible. So I really appreciate what you said about how long the feels last a long time. And we got that in spades during our interview last week, right, Andrea?
Yes, but I would like to also bring this back to what you just said, John Cary, which is this idea that this nucleus is impacted. And because what I'm noticing, my theory is that America is full of a bunch of traumatized people walking around. Because we have these events that now with social media, it's like we are impacted by things that normally, wouldn't have touched us because we can bring it so close to us. In your professional career, what is an event that had enormous community impact that you had to manage? And what did you learn from that? And then what can we look at as a takeaway?
Yeah, I can give you a couple right off the top of my head. One was personal to me, and the other was professional. I had a double homicide, and I can't tell you the years, but we had two young Mercer University students that were parking at the lake up here in Monroe County, at a place called The Point. They both didn't show back up, and we got a call, and both of them were killed at the lake. One was outside of the car. The young lady was outside the car, and the man was in the car, and they'd both been shot and killed. And it was a case that went on. It took us over 2 years pulling records and just doing shoe leather work to come up with a lead. And it turned out to be the guy that did it turned out to be an FBI agent's son who was very close personal friends with me. And his daughter and her husband actually sat directly in front of me and my wife at church every Sunday. And that's who it turned out to be. And what I saw there, the impact that it had, not only, of course, what a horrible impact for their parents and their immediate family, but the impact that it had on their fraternity and sorority brothers and sisters at Mercer and the Mercer campus as a whole. it just had this huge impact on the entire community. And of course, because it took so long working the case, it got to be one of those things that every year news stories would come out. Every year, everybody was having to relive that. And so like I said, it was a little over 2 years before we were able to develop the lead to the guy. And of course, he has since been executed. The story it just keeps going on and on. And it has impacted those families. And I'm sure some of the kids that went to school with them to this day. You send your kids off to college for this whole happy college educational experience. And for something like that to happen and have the impact on the family and the community like that, I don't think that kind of trauma ever really goes away. Jen will tell you that I lost my first wife when I was 28 years old. I had just was running for sheriff for the first time. My dad had gone to Washington, and my first wife was an asthmatic. I had just graduated from the FBI Academy at the end of September and came home. We had just built a new home, a log home on our ranch, and had just moved in. And I don't think we'd spent more than 3 or 4 nights in the new house. And she had a real bad asthma attack. And of course, we called an ambulance and got it there, but she died. And that's another thing that you realize the position that you're in. After she died at the hospital, we went over to my dad's house. And in an hour, the whole front yard of my dad's house was full of people from every segment of the community. They all came up there and just stood in the front yard because they all wanted to be there for us. Because you'd spent all these years, when bad things happened to them, you'd spent all these years helping all those people. And it was like that when we went back to church. My oldest son was 10 years old at the time. And when we were finally able to go back to church, when we sat down in the church and the choir started singing hymns, everybody stands up, starts singing. And I look around, everybody in the church is crying. And so that kind of traumatic event has huge impact on people. And even today, I have people ask me about that. And that's not something that you ever forget. You just never forget it.
It is incredibly shocking that happened. I've actually never heard a story of an event where someone had an asthma attack and died. And maybe I'm just ignorant about asthma.
So it's really unusual, really unusual.
Yeah, that is so shocking. And I'm honored that you just shared that story with us. And I think what I hear from that is that was a community that showed up for you, that held you to heal, and it wasn't just like they were just holding you. Everybody was holding everybody else because it meant that much to everyone. And that is stunning. And that loss is shocking.
Yeah, it's one of the reasons that I stayed for 35 and a half years, because, there were points in my career where I could have moved on to other things. But one of the reasons that I stayed was because I never really, even today, never really felt like I had completely ever paid that debt back.
We call this show the Hero Maker Podcast, right? We haven't talked a lot about what that means or why we call it that. The idea is that there are these events that happen where people rise, beyond their previous level of courage, or go above and beyond in a way that others would see them as heroic. What I'm hearing from you is that you were called into being as a sheriff, as the sheriff, multiple times in your life, and that you responded to that call, that the community made you the sheriff. It's kind of like, the king isn't the king unless there are people bowing down to him, right? Like, it takes the public to really hold you in that esteem and level of respect, so you can actually fulfill your potential, I guess, as a human being.
As opposed to the king being the king, I think the analogy I would use would be the servant being the servant, because I never ever, even to this day, I never ever saw that job as, whether it's when I was president of the national sheriffs and dealing with sheriffs all over the country or here, I never really ever saw that job as though you were the boss, because people that are really good at that are the people that are the servants, not the ones that are power bound or there for a power reason. The value of the power is that you can help people, use it to help people. If the value of power becomes what you get out of it yourself, then you become one of these guys that winds up with handcuffs on, as opposed to the other way around.
If you or someone you know is connected either personally or as the result of violent crime to Alfredo Prieto, a convicted rapist and killer who lived in and around San Bernardino, California, Arlington, Virginia, and Jamaica, Queens, New York between the years of 1984 and 1990, we'd like to hear from you. Please email us at info@theheromakerpodcast.com.
So, Sheriff, when you were talking about the sudden, unexpected death of your first wife, it struck me that that happened just before you got elected as sheriff. And so you were still young in your law enforcement career. And I wonder if you've ever had any reflections on how that personal experience fed into or played into your professional role in, say, the double murder you spoke about, or other tragic cases in the community, cases that might have been scary for the community. I just wonder how that informed your leadership and your relationship between crime victims, survivors.
Amongst the people that were in the front yard that night were everyday community, people from this community, people from our church, people from our neighborhood, people that you really weren't that close to their family, but you realized how close they felt to yours when that happened. But amongst those people were tons of deputies and people that worked at the sheriff's office. And all of a sudden, that now, when something like that happens, these people cease to just be employees and become to be like your sons and daughters. And I think over a period of time, what I began to feel was that these are like my own kids. And it's the people that are here now, the sheriff, the chief deputy. I honestly feel about them like they're my own kids and like they're my own sons. And I'm proud of what they're doing and proud of what they've accomplished, because they've done an outstanding job. And if that kind of answers your question, Jen, I think by virtue of the fact that I realized when the chips were down for me, I realized for the rest of my life, I need to be there for them when the chips are down for them. So,
do you think it gave you a degree of empathy that a rising star, pretty self-confident 28-year-old guy just fresh out of NA class, do you think it gave you a degree of empathy or compassion that you might not have had?
We graduated from the NA like in late September, and this happened in October. So I think you being an NA graduate yourself, you come home and you've been around all these sharp, articulate, professional people for 10, 11 weeks, and you're puffed up, basically, I think. And I think with that happening right after that, it's probably one of the reasons that I didn't stay puffed up as long as I would have, because I realized that even these guys that are here that have only been here a year or two, they care this much about me. So being sheriff is going to be my responsibility to care about them. And it's the same way with the community. I mean, there's really no real difference between the community and the deputies. I don't know that I'll ever be able to pay back what this community gave to me, both that time and then, as you know, back in 2014, we lost a young deputy sheriff here that was killed in the line of duty. The two officers were involved. One was wounded and one actually died. And he was a young kid. He was about my son's age. My son and he were good friends. And, and that was a really traumatic thing for the whole agency. But I think having gone through what I did earlier when Chrissy died, that helped me realize, hey, it's not just the family that this affects. It affects this nucleus of people. And it literally, having an officer killed like that in a relatively small community, it actually impacted almost everybody, if not every family in the county. I mean, it was traumatic.
I'm wondering, you have this benefit of being in this small community. You've obviously are of service and you have an experience of family for all these different reasons with the force, but also with the community. I feel like if you could articulate for someone who's in a much bigger city, like a Houston or an LA or a New York, where they're really struggling to rebuild community, where there's been this very public anti-law enforcement sentiment that's been going around, what wisdom do you feel like you can transmit that may make some kind of difference, even though there are so many different varied circumstances? I'm sure I'd love to hear if you have something to pass on, something even just simple that could make all the difference.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I have seen sheriffs in very large communities, some of the largest in the country, that actually got it and understood the importance of the role being of somebody of service as opposed to somebody that's there to try to arrest people. I think that I've seen it in larger communities and smaller communities. And I think if the leader gets that equation, if they understand how important it is to be part of the community and to help these people. I mean, I've seen the sheriff in the largest sheriff's office in the United States. We were at lunch one day and his cell phone rang and he answered his cell phone. And it was this lady that was having trouble with her son and she wanted him to help her. And that is the largest sheriff's office in the United States. And he stopped what he was doing for lunch and sat there and talked to her and was empathetic to her and told her he was going to have somebody come by and talk to them and hook them up with the right programs to help their family. Well, if he could do it, anybody can. I mean, when you talk about somebody that got elected by a 60-40% split, he had 1 million people vote against him. So, and he actually got it. So I think that more people get it than you think. The atmosphere today is like a whole nother ballgame. I think the 24-hour news cycle plays into that tremendously. But somewhere along the line, people are going to have to realize we got to tune out this noise, this 24 hours a day of second guessing everything that everybody does, but ourselves. The media wants to second guess everything everybody does, but the media. And so what happens is, I think people just, they live it. They get in their mind, they think one police shooting, well, if this is happening there and it's on the news every night, well, it must be happening in every community. It must be happening everywhere, which is just not factual. But you can't get to the facts because the news cycle every night is just beating something to death. So, I mean, I'm anything but down on the news media. I had great relationships with the news media here, both when I was marshal and when I was sheriff. So I'm not down on the news media. I think it's the 24-hour cycle of having to go over every story over and over and over again. And it starts to make it look like that this occurs in every community, everywhere, the exact same way. When actually the case that they're running every night is an anomaly. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
It does. I think about the fact that you've just wrapped up an incredible career, a career that is more than most people could ever hope for when they walk in the doors as a young deputy or a young police officer. And even just in the, I don't even want to do the math of how long I've known you, but it's been a really long time.
24.
24, almost. Oh, maybe
math.
it's our 25th anniversary soon. I don't know. But when I think about so much that has changed, I wonder, John Cary, what you would tell yourself if you today could ride in a squad car with you the year before or the year after you got initially sworn in as sheriff, or you starting out right out of the academy. What nuggets of wisdom would you tell yourself?
If you're going to be in law enforcement today, particularly if you're going to be a chief or a sheriff or in a leadership position, you better be there for the right reasons, and you better want to be there to help people. Because if you don't, the strain is going to get to you, and it's not going to take long for something like that to happen, because the next traffic stop or the next interaction could be that interaction where you're on the 24-hour news. So it literally is just one traffic stop away for every law enforcement officer in the United States.
How long have you been retired, and what do you miss?
A short period of time. My last day at the Marshal Service was July the 2nd, so not very long. But I can tell you that even when I was Marshal, and particularly now, you miss the interaction with people. You miss hey, somebody picking up the telephone because they need you for some reason. The biggest thing I miss is the interaction with the public like that, and my ability to help somebody. Now you're just, for the most part, you're not using it. Every now and then you'll get a phone call from a sheriff or a chief or somebody that'll ask, do you know anybody in Vermont that can help me with something? And I can hook them up with somebody, and that kind of thing. But that kind of thing used to happen daily. Every day there was somebody calling about that.
Jen, I'd love to hear you speak to this too, but I think it's the reason John Cary, illuminated the reason why Jen cannot retire, why she's failing at retirement. I really am seeing that when you are used to working at this really intense daily level, you have a capacity to handle an immense amount of challenge and problem solving, and you have a gift, and to all of a sudden not have an outlet for that, you go into like some crazy mustache land where you're like, I'm going to spend 6 hours creating the best mustache in history.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I'm pretty bad at staying retired, it appears, but I still have a lot of good years left in me. And so I think I guess they would say ripe for the picking, in that when the right person or opportunity came along, like I think back to when I went back as the interim chief in Burlington at a time when the organization was in disarray and needing strong, authentic leadership. I knew that was the right thing for me. It was like, there was no way I could say no to BPD at that time. It was my first love in policing, right? It was where I learned how to be a cop and spent the better part of my career. And I think about all the people along the way who built these connections and relationships. John Cary and I both had the good fortune to go to the FBI National Academy, and you build relationships and friendships all over the world, and those never go away. We were both involved in the Commission on Accreditation for Law Enforcement Agencies. And again, that's an area where you network with people who are in that sort of small slice of law enforcement, the accreditation world. And they're really smart people in that slice of law enforcement. So you build your network and your relationships there. We were both involved with our respective organizations, him with the National Sheriffs, me with the International Association of Chiefs of Police. You build your network there. So when you have a reputation of being able to get things done and deliver outcomes, and you couple that with a sincere need, like I said, when the mayor of Burlington asked me to come back, and then later when the then Commissioner of Public Safety asked me to come on board the public safety team, it was impossible to say no.
I think I know why she keeps coming back to work, and I think it's because Jen's one of those chosen people in law enforcement that actually gets, she has a heart the size of Texas, And you can see it not only in her personal life, you can see it in her professional life. I mean, she's just such a catch for somebody that's looking for a leadership change, somebody that really wants to make a difference in the community or a difference in the state. You just can't be around her and not see the size of her heart when it comes to caring about what she's doing. And it doesn't matter whether it's accreditation stuff or whether it's was stuff in Burlington or Colchester. I've seen it time and time and time again where it's just stuff is so important to her, you know?
The Williamson County Cultural Arts Commission of Franklin, Tennessee wishes to thank our men and women in blue who help us deliver safe and fun family and community cultural events year-round, including one of the only authentic bluegrass festivals in the country. Bluegrass Along the Harpeth takes place every July and at the Williamson County Fair in August and at the annual Tennessee International Independent Film Festival. Check out our full calendar of events at wccac-tn.org.
I guess she's wondering how a tough, lifelong Southern sheriff has dealt with some of the exposure to ongoing trauma.
You know, I don't know. I look back at those instances like we talked about earlier with Chrissy died or when Michael got killed. And I see times when I probably didn't react as well as I should have. I think particularly at the time when Michael got killed, I struggle with realizing how much all of that actually meant to the community and almost internalized it for a short period of time, like this is happening to us, thinking about the sheriff's office as opposed to the impact that it was having on the community. And one of the sheriffs, Bill Massey, over in Baldwin County, he had had a young deputy killed many, many years ago. And I can remember thinking as my career progressed, you know, I just hope I don't ever join that club. If I can just get out the door without joining that club, because I don't want to be a member of that club. And I think Bill saw that I was doing that, and he literally drove to the hospital and called me off to the side and said, hey, you got to realize this is just not happening to the sheriff's office. The entire community sees this as being important. And of course, as soon as he saw it, I thought, you know, right back to what my dad said, I realized that it was important that I go out there and tell the public what was going on and what the impact was and what was happening, that it wasn't just happening to the sheriff's office. It was happening to the community as a whole. And you're talking about a period of a day or so that all of that transpired. But, you know, it just took a good friend and somebody that had been through it before to point it out exactly what was going on, and you just got to adjust course. So I don't know that I've always reacted exactly the way that I would have liked to react at the time, but I think I've always at least gone back and tried to do the right thing.
Do you think that the relationships with other law enforcement practitioners helps you have space to talk about the things that are hard? I can think of a few cases where being able to discuss the nitty-gritty, the goriness, or the fear even of a case that I had with a colleague, with someone like you, with my other friends and mentors, that being able to talk about it and knowing the person isn't going to be squeamish, knowing that they're going to understand, was a way to offload some of the stuff that happened in my career.
When I think about Michael, the day that I walked into the hospital, the first thing that I noticed, that there was a group over in the corner, and it was all sheriffs, like 15 different sheriffs, that actually had come down there and was with the family and with all those deputies down there. And from all segments of the state. I mean, just wasn't somebody just the surrounding counties. It was from all over the state. They had driven as far as I could think of one, Wiley Griffin, that drove all the way from the Florida, his county's on the Florida line. And he drove all the way to Macon to the hospital that night. I think that you're 100% right. While I probably run a lot of things across Jen and John Domino and other people, I think it's that way with all the sheriffs. You've got to be able to have other people both in the profession and outside the profession that you can just sit down and talk to. I can think of my pastor at the time when that happened with Michael. I bet I stayed in his office for 2 or 3 hours just venting, how can this happen? You try to buy the right equipment, you try to do the right training, you try to do all the right things and have all the right professional rules, but yet it still happens. You think you are mitigating the risk when you're not mitigating the risk.
Well, because you can't control human behavior and you can't control evil.
You can't control what that other guy's going to do. And that's why I said what I said about the 24-hour news cycle, and your next traffic stop could be the one that puts you on it. Because no matter how much training that officer gets, no matter what equipment that officer has, the next traffic stop could still be the guy that he has no control, over what that guy does. And so it could happen to anybody. It can happen to the best cops with the best intentions, because there's a part of the equation that you just can't control. And I think that you're 100% right about that.
I know we're kind of winding down a little bit in terms of time. You've been so generous, not just with your experience, but also with your heart. Thank you for sharing such, you've been very intimate with us, and I really appreciate that. I have a question. Jennifer shared with me that you created something for, I think it was for women and children, something called the Care Cottage.
Right.
You saw a need, and that got created. And so I'd love to hear the need that you saw and what you created.
2 things. One, about the Care Cottage, the way that came about was that early on, in the very early 80s, I was sheriff and my dad was executive director of the National Sheriffs. And I was going back and forth to D.C. for some national sheriff's meetings, and some of those meetings were around victims' rights and victims' experiences and that kind of thing. Listening to what those people were saying, I realized that I'm sitting down there and I've got this whole group of victims throughout the community that really don't have a support group. And some of the district attorneys were jumping on that, but very few of the sheriffs and chiefs were jumping on. Most of them saw that as the DA's purview. And I got to thinking about it, and I realized that, well, the DA is going to see those people that are going to court where there's been an arrest made. They're going to see those victims. But that's 3 cases out of 10 or whatever. And so you've got 70% of the victims that are out here that if the case never goes to court or nobody's ever made an arrest on the case, there's no support group for that. And so I came back and we applied for a grant, a DOJ grant, and got it. And we started this group, we called it the Sheriff's Care Cottage, with the idea that they would help serve these victims that were not getting attention. And then that kind of turned into a support group for the schools and that kind of thing. And then we realized we were getting these kids that were getting in trouble in the summertime. And we started kicking around, well, why is this happening? And of course, when they're in school, they're in a structured environment. Then in the summertime, they just don't have any support. And so Care Cottage morphed from not only just serving those victims, but it morphed into this, what can we do for these kids in the summertime, and what kind of programs can we have for them? And then I had a bunch of friends. One was a psychologist, one was a pharmacist, one was a local doctor, attorneys, and they're asking me, what can we do to help with this? Well, I realized that these kids, some of them never saw a doctor because their families couldn't afford to take them to a doctor. And they certainly were not getting the psychological resources that they needed. So the care cottage kind of morphed into this service provider and coordinating all these services. And these doctors literally volunteered. You know, if you got a kid that needs help, that needs that situation, you bring me to me. We're going to treat him. We're going to give him his medicines. All this is going to be paid for. And so you had these group of professionals within the community that kind of rose to the occasion to help those people. And the kids, if they had a problem, they could call the care cottage, and the care cottage was there to try to help fix whatever they needed.
Wow.
And it became so popular in the community that we literally built this house out in this neighborhood, and it's all paid for. The community paid for it. We would put something in the paper, the care cottage needs furniture, and people would show up with trucks with new furniture and just give it to the care cottage. And so the care cottage has always been self-sufficient between the grants that we got and the money that the community gave. They've always had money to do some of these innovative things that you just normally can't get your hands around.
But it didn't just happen. Like, people didn't just give money. Somebody had the vision and somebody saw the need, and that was you.
Well, thanks, but
And you and your team.
Yeah. Mostly the team, less me than the team.
Amazing. But also part two of the question, if you could wave your magic wand right now, like I'd love to hear a need that you're seeing out there right now that if you were still in the game, you would want to work to meet that need.
Yeah. You know, I would love for there to be a way. And it's not just in the South when you think about it, it's all over the country. But I would love for there to be some way that we could mesh communities together. Like here in the South, it's mostly minority communities and white communities. And they go to different churches. I think that would be a game changer with a lot of the problems that law enforcement faces today, that if we could all be seen some kind of way as being one community and one neighborhood or one, group of people.
I immediately think of public schools as like that was supposed to be a way to do that, but then those school lines are drawn on economic lines, and they're drawn on neighborhood lines, and then those neighborhoods tend to get segregated for different reasons. Or public parks, I don't know, maybe they get made in neighborhoods that it stays segregated for some reason. I mean, it's a really great question. Jen, did anything come into mind that you've seen that promotes that kind of like interaction between and among different communities and segments of the population?
Well, I think what the sheriff is saying is exactly what every credible law enforcement leader is trying to do. I completely identified with what he said about meshing the communities together, and it speaks deeply to me about the concept of social cohesion and collective efficacy, about how we invest in our communities and how we take notice of things that are out of place in our communities. We used to be a community that everybody knew their neighbors and knew everybody's name and recognized their car. We're now neighborhoods of people who drive into their driveway, they click a button, garage door goes up, they drive in, click a button, garage door goes down, and the only thing their neighbor might know about them is that they cut their grass on Saturday and they walk their dog at 6 a.m. every morning and every night. That might be the only interaction they have. So we've really lost that knitting together of communities, and sometimes when I'm talking publicly about it, I talk about the fabric of society being torn, and we really have to find a way to get that cohesion back. Knitting things back together, and that means across all socioeconomic groups, racial groups, religious groups. Everybody has to be part of that social cohesion, because we are stumbling around in the dark right now as society at large.
I think you're dead right, Jen. It's like everybody has moved into these little group, my team and your team, and I don't know what it will take, but I think for the country to survive, and particularly for law enforcement to survive, we're going to have to get out there and show not only when something bad happens that we want to be part of the community. We've got to do it daily. We've got to daily be part of that community. So I think you hit the nail on the head.
Well, I know that we've taken up more of your time than we asked for, and I would like to compliment you, sir, on not just everything that you brought to our podcast recording, but on your incredible tech skills. You did great.
that once again was Courtney. So yeah, it's the people you surround yourself with.
Well, and that you pretty much just summed up what makes you so special, is that you think it's never you. And the reality is it's always you.
Tell the kids I said hey, and it was very nice to meet you, Andrea.
Nice to meet you too, John Cary. Thanks for being with us. Thanks to audio producer, mixmaster, and sound designer Andy Bill of Submachine Audio. Thanks also to media producer Michael Doherty. And thanks to me, Hero Maker director and producer Andrea Schreeman. Please subscribe to the show where you listen to podcasts and take a moment to rate us. It really helps the podcast grow. We're also on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at The Hero Maker Pod. Want to collaborate or suggest a guest? Please email us at media@theheromakerpodcast.com. The Hero Maker Podcast is a production of Prudent Pictures. Thanks so much for listening.